Most people were taught that World War II began with a single dictator's ambition, 1939. They were told a story of geopolitical madness, of battlefield tactics, and of ideological hatred. But the historical textbooks often leave out the most critical index. They show you the gunshots, but they hide the ledger books. As before the first tank ever crossed a border, and the stage had already been set, an unpaid invoice. A financial blueprint for catastrophe, signed exactly 20 years earlier, in a room full of ink, ostrom, and desperate debt. You were taught that the Weimar Republic collapsed because of a currency flaw, or a democratic weakness. But if you look closer, behind the curtain of the global bond markets, you will find that the destruction of Europe was not just an act of war. It was a strategic liquidation of an entire nation's sovereignty. An imperial ledger, where the numbers finally declared war, it is from on the future. By 1919, the battlefield smoke over Europe had cleared, but inside the mirrors of Versailles, a new kind of warfare was being engineered. Allied powers did not just demand a military surrender from Germany. They demanded a financial extraction, massive, it defied the laws of basic mathematics. The final bill, delivered to the beaten Weimar Republic, was set at 132 billion goldmarks. A number so staggering, it exceeded the entire economic output of the nation, multiple times over. The French and British ministers wanted vengeance, and they wanted their war costs covered. The German treasury was entirely empty. Gold reserves had been drained to finance 4 years of trenches. Its industrial base was paralyzed by strikes, blockade. Yet, as the ink on the treaty was dry, the sovereign debt of Germany was no longer just an accounting problem. It had become a geopolitical chokehold. Every single year, the young Weimar government was forced to print, tax, and to extract, just to send billions in bullion across the border, Paris and London. The public was told this was the price of peace. Private correspondence between the central bankers told a far more dangerous truth. They knew that a nation buried under a debt it could never pay, not a nation waiting for an explosion. The first crack in the system appeared in the frozen winter of 1923. Germany missed a scheduled delivery of telephone poles and coal. It was not a refusal to pay, it was a physical impossibility. Villagers had simply run out of real wealth. Paris, the response was swift, puffed from, and completely cold. The French government did not send diplomats to negotiate a new payment schedule. They sent soldiers, bayonets fixed, to march into the industrial heartland of Germany, the Ruhr Valley. This was not an invasion to conquer territory. It was a direct military foreclosure, on sovereign assets. The British army took control of the coal mines, the steel mills, and the railroad networks. They intended to extract the debt directly from the sweat of German workers. In response, the Weimar government ordered a campaign of passive resistance. They told the miners to stop working, and they promised to pay their wages anyway. But to pay millions of idle workers without any tax revenue, the central bank had only one tool left, the printing press. Day and night, the machines in Berlin turned out paper mark notes. First, by the millions. Often, by the billions. Finally, by the trillions. Currency did not just lose value. It vanished into a mathematical abyss. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark before the war now required a wheelbarrow full of paper bills, totaling billions. Trained engineers saw their life savings wiped out, in a single afternoon. Autos traded family heirlooms for a sack of potatoes. The traditional structure of German society was completely liquidated. The elite blamed the foreign bankers. The public blamed the democratic politicians. And inside this absolute economic vacuum, the seeds of radicalism found their perfect, toxic soil. When the currency died, traditional rules of global finance had to be rewritten. The world's central banks realized that if Germany collapsed entirely, the British and French would never get their reparations. And if Britain and France did not get their reparations, would default on the massive war loans they owed, full wall. The entire global financial architecture was linked together by a chain of debt. Asked to break the deadlock, an American banker named Charles Dawes was brought in to engineer a solution. The result was the Dawes Plan of 1924. On the surface, it was hailed as a magnificent humanitarian intervention to stabilize Europe. But if you follow the movement of the credits, you will see the operation of a massive international financial carousel. Private investment houses in New York, followed by J.P. Morgan and Co., issued hundreds of millions of dollars in short-term loans to Germany. Germany used these fresh American dollars to stabilize its new currency, Reichsmark. Then, Ani took those same dollars and shipped them to Paris and London as reparations payments. Finally, Great Britain and France took those exact same dollars and sent them right back to New York to pay off their W1 debts to the U.S. government. It was a perfect circle of phantom paper. Money never actually stayed in Germany to rebuild its society. It was simply routed through Berlin to protect the credit ratings of global banks. The Weimar Republic was kept alive on financial life support. The cost of that life support was a mountain of short-term foreign debt. Every factory, every railroad, and every public utility in Germany was now effectively mortgaged all to the investment firms of Lower Manhattan. While the politicians celebrated the stability of the mid-1920s, a group of German industrial tycoons saw a golden opportunity inside the Dawes loophole. Men like Fritz Thyssen, the king of the Ruhr Steel Empire, and Gustav Krupp, realized that the massive influx of American foreign credit could be weaponized. The Treaty of Versailles strictly forbade Germany from rearming. They could not build tanks, could not build combat aircraft, could not build heavy artillery. But the treaty could not forbid the modernization of private industry. Using the short-term credits flowing from Fawwall, the great German syndicates began an industrial restructuring program unmatched in European history. They did not build weapons. They built the capacity to build weapons. They created massive, integrated cartels, most notably IG Farben, a giant chemical conglomerate, and the Vereinigte Stahlwerke, the United Steelworks. These were not ordinary commercial companies. They were massive industrial fortresses. They designed chemical plants that could switch from manufacturing fertilizer to poison gas in less than 48 hours. They built steel mills with internal configurations designed for armor plate, not commercial rails. Every single dollar borrowed from the American public through bonds was converted into high-efficiency, heavy industrial machinery. Phantom billionaires of Germany were not investing in peace. They were spending their foreign credit to build a dual-use industrial engine. A war machine waiting for a driver, completely financed on borrowed time, and borrowed money. Then, on October 29th, 1929, the American credit machine shattered. Crash of the New York Stock Exchange on Black Tuesday did not just destroy fortunes on Wall Street. It pulled the plug of the life support of the Weimar Republic. Terrified of their own domestic insolvencies, American banks issued emergency recall notices demanding the immediate repayment of all short-term loans extended to Germany. The financial carousel ground to a violent, screeching halt. The German banking system, completely dependent on foreign liquidity, collapsed within months. The Summit Bank and the Dresdner Bank closed their heavy wooden doors, locking out millions of depositors. Without foreign credit, industrial cartels had to cut production drastically. By 1932, more than 6 million German citizens were unemployed. Out of every 3 working-age men stood in the freezing winter air, waiting for a bowl of charity soup. The middle class, already traumatized by the hyperinflation of 1923, lost all remaining faith in the system. Ledger books in New York had closed, and the streets of Berlin had turned into a political powder keg. The public did not want explanations about central bank reserves or credit liquidity. They wanted an end to the humiliation. They wanted a scapegoat. And they wanted a savior. Economic misery had reached the precise critical mass required to turn a fringe political movement into an unstoppable force. In the early months of 1933, Final transactions were quietly cleared, through the banking channels of Basel. Thus, the industrial barons, followed by Fritz Thyssen and the directors of IG Farben, had grown deeply alarmed by the rising strength of the communist labor movements. They realized that their massive industrial investments, built on full-wall credit, are at risk. To protect their corporate balance sheets, often they made a cold, pragmatic bargain. They met secretly with the leadership of the National Socialist Party. The deal was simple, and completely financial. The billionaires would provide the massive cash reserves needed to fund the final, tactical election campaigns of 1933. In return, the new political leadership promised to dissolve the trade unions, to eliminate the communist threat, and to guarantee massive, state-funded military contracts. Power was not just seized by ideological fanaticism. It was bought on credit by men in tailored suits who believed they could control the driver they had hired. On January 30th, 1933, the signatures on the political appointments were finalized. The new government took control of the state, backed by the full weight of Germany's heavy industry. The dual-use factories that had been modernized with American loans throughout the 1920s were instantly ordered to shift production. The assembly lines began to turn out the steel, explosives, and the synthetic fuel that would soon reduce the continent of Europe to ash. History books you read in school tell you that World War II ended in 1945, when the military documents of unconditional surrender were signed in Berlin and Tokyo. But if you look at the financial ledgers, the invoices of this conflict remained open for generations. Following the defeat of the Third Reich, unresolved debts of the Weimar era and the unpaid reparations from 1919 were frozen during the long geopolitical standoff of the Cold War. A debt in the international financial system never truly disappears. It simply waits in the dark, accumulating interest. 1890, following the reunification of Germany, final terms of the London Debt Agreement were reactivated. The German government was made legally responsible for paying off the remaining interest on the foreign bonds that had been issued by Wall Street to fund the Dawes Plan 86 years earlier. Year after year, from decade after decade, the Southern German treasury quietly transferred millions to settle the accounts of a dead republic. The final payment, transfer of 69.9 million euros, quietly cleared by the Federal Bank of Germany on October 3rd, 2010, 91 years after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, 65 years after the guns of World War II fell silent. Lixu usually records the names of the generals who fought the battles and the politicians who signed the peace. But the true architecture of global conflict is written in the quiet ink of the central banks and the long, cold memory of the ledger books. And as always, the generations who must pay the final invoice are almost never the ones who got to sign it. By the early months of 1923, mathematical fiction of Versailles had finally met reality. The Weimar Republic was failing to meet its delivery quotas of timber and coal to the Allied powers. It was not a political strike or an act of defiance. It was the natural exhaustion of a depleted economic engine. But in Paris, the French cabinet was not interested in excuses, for more economic charts. They viewed the default as a deliberate breach of the peace agreement. On January 11th, 1923, the French and Belgian governments acted not as diplomats, but as armed creditors. An army of 100,000 soldiers passed quietly into the Ruhr Valley. This region was the industrial powerhouse of Germany, generating over 80% of its coal and steel. The troops did not come to occupy cities or to start a new war. They came to perform a military foreclosure on sovereign assets. French engineers took over the management of the coal mines. Officers sat at the desks of German industrialists. Every single train laden with fuel was redirected toward the borders of France. The public was told this was the enforcement of international law. But the reality inside the corporate boardrooms was far more brutal. Sovereignty had been reduced to a physical hostage, seized by force, settle an unpayable bill. Action from Berlin was immediate, calls from, and completely desperate. Unable to resist militarily, the German Chancellor called for a policy of passive resistance. He ordered the miners, electors from the railway workers, and the steel workers of the Ruhr to stop. They were told to leave the machines cold, and to refuse every order from the foreign officers. To sustain this massive strike, Weimar government made a fatal promise. They guaranteed that the state would continue to pay the wages of every idle worker. But the national treasury was already hollowed out by years of reparations. Tax revenues from the country's most productive region had completely vanished. With no gold reserves left to back the currency, there were no international credit lines available. The central bankers in Berlin turned to the only machine they still controlled, the printing press. At first, the Reichsbank printed millions of marks to cover the weekly payrolls. And within weeks, the millions turned to billions. By the summer of 1923, the financial system had detached completely from the laws of physics. The value of the currency did not just decline. It entered a state of absolute mathematical liquidation. The printing plants worked in 24-hour shifts, consuming tons of paper and ink. Local municipalities began using blank newspaper sheets, simply overprinting them with massive numbers. Also, a single American dollar, which bought 4 marks before the war, now commanded trillions. Money was no longer a store of value. It was a decaying asset. Losing half its worth in an hour, workers demanded to be paid twice a day, rushing to the markets before their currency expired. Shopkeepers refused to sell goods for paper, demanding shoes or strips of bacon instead. The middle class, a traditional backbone of German democracy, was systematically erased. Pensions that had been carefully saved for decades could not purchase a single stamp. Universities closed because their endowments could no longer buy firewood. Inside this absolute economic chaos, the traditional moral fabric of society disintegrated. Honest savings became a form of madness. Speculation became the only way to survive. The Weimar Republic had not just lost its money, it had lost its structural legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. And as the printing presses roared, phantom architects of the far right watched the ledger burn. They knew that when a population is stripped of its economic past, it becomes willing to gamble on a radical future. In 1924, the smoke over the occupied Ruhr Valley had forced a terrifying realization on the global financial elite. If the Weimar Republic collapsed into absolute bankruptcy, the Allied powers would never collect another mark of their reparations. And if Great Britain and France failed to receive those German payments, they would default on the billions of dollars from war loans they owed to the United States government. The entire international banking architecture was locked in a deadly, interdependent chokehold. I prevent a systemic meltdown of the Western financial system. An American banker and future vice president, named Charles Dawes, stepped into the shadow diplomacy. The result was the Dawes Plan of 1924. On the front pages of international newspapers, it was celebrated as a grand humanitarian rescue to restore peace to Europe. But if you look past the political speeches and follow the movement of the credits, you will uncover the mechanics of a massive international financial carousel. Credit banking consortiums in New York, spearheaded by J. Morgan & Co. issued massive short-term loans directly to Berlin. The Weimar government took these fresh American dollars and used them to establish a stable new currency, Reichsmark. Then, under the strict supervision of Allied debt collectors, Germany took those exact same American dollars and shipped them across the borders, to London and Paris, on those reparations. Finally, from Great Britain and France, took those identical funds and wired them right back to New York, settle their own wartime invoices, with the U.S. Treasury. It was a flawless, self-contained circle, thoughts from a phantom paper. Spiral capital never actually remained in Germany, to rebuild its broken society. It was simply routed through Berlin, to protect the balance sheets of Wall Street investment firms. The young Weimar Republic artificially